In the silent depths of the North Atlantic, an invisible war was being waged. A war of pressure and patience, of acoustics and shadows. This was the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom Gap, a critical choke point in the Cold War, and the ocean floor was wired for sound. Every engine pulse, every turn of a propeller, was a secret whispered across hundreds of miles of submerged cable. In a quiet humming room in Keflavik, Iceland, one man was listening. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Bradley. The coffee beside him had been cold for 2 hours. He hadn't noticed. His entire world was compressed into the cascading green lines of a waterfall display. The raw data of the abyss translated into a language only a handful of men could read. It was October 1981. For 8 years, Bradley had learned the rhythms of this deep-sea ballet. He knew the signatures of the sock boat, its 7-bladed propeller a distinctive thrum. The complex, layered harmonics of a Delta-class ballistic missile submarine, a mechanical fingerprint unique to each vessel. He could even spot the clumsy, mechanical cacophony of the aging diesel-electric November class, their outdated technology broadcasts. The midnight watch was a long, slow descent into routine. Then, at 4:23 Zulu time, a new voice entered the choir. It appeared without warning, a signature that defied every known pattern in NATO's exhaustive acoustic library. The phosphorescent lines painted a picture of something massive, a ghost in the machine. Initial displacement estimates were staggering, exceeding 24,000 tons, larger than any operational submarine the Soviets had ever sent to sea. This was a leviathan. But it was the sound itself that froze the blood. The energy was distributed across frequencies that made no sense, with harmonic patterns that seemed deliberately engineered to confuse, to mimic the background noise of the ocean itself. It was a predator designed for perfect camouflage. This was not just a new class of submarine. It was a new philosophy of warfare. A weapon built not just for power, but for utter invisibility. The hum of the cooling fans in the operations center suddenly felt deafening. The world outside, the Icelandic wind, the distant shore, it all ceased to exist. There was only the screen, the glowing green lines, and the chilling realization that the rules of the game had just been rewritten by an unseen hand. The invisible battlefield had a new, terrifying player, and Thomas Bradley was the first man on Earth to hear its song. 400 meters of displaced water, a moving mountain of steel generating an acoustic signature that should have screamed across half the Norwegian Sea. Yet it was a fractured whisper. Certain frequencies were eerily silent, carved out of the sonic spectrum with surgical precision, as if a ghost in the machine was choosing, moment by moment, what it wanted the world to hear. On the sonar screen, it was an anomaly. In the mind of the operator, it had a name whispered in the halls of Western intelligence for years. Typhoon. The fabled Project 941. Its legend began not in the deep, but from the cold eye of a satellite staring down at the Severodvinsk shipyard on the White Sea. Since 1976, NATO had watched it grow. Grainy photographs revealed construction halls of a scale that defied belief, sparking furious debate among analysts. Some saw a bluff, a Potemkin village of naval engineering. Others recognized that something fundamentally different was emerging from the Soviet shipyards. The structures were staggering. Covered bays capable of berthing a vessel over 170 meters long, with a beam stretching nearly 23 meters. These were not dimensions for a submarine. They were the blueprints for a submerged cathedral. The prevailing wisdom in NATO circles was clear, almost dogmatic. A machine of this magnitude could not hide. The laws of physics were not suggestions. More surface area meant more radiated sound. More machinery meant more noise. Stealth and size were opposing forces. The Soviets, it was concluded, were building a monster for parades, a psychological weapon whose only real power was its own immense, clumsy presence. For 23 minutes, Chief Petty Officer Bradley watched the impossible glide through his sensors. A steady course, 275 degrees, a deliberate speed of approximately 11 knots. The hydrophone triangulation was perfect, painting a target accurate to within 2 nautical miles. Doppler analysis confirmed its velocity. Even the harmonics of its propulsion whispered a secret. A 7-bladed propeller, a design familiar from other Soviet classes. Every piece of data was a contradiction. A perfect track of a vessel that, by all accounts, should not have been this quiet. The doctrine was clear. The protocols for tracking a Soviet ballistic missile submarine transiting the Greenland Iceland. The call went out, a message slicing through the Arctic air to the P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft stationed at Keflavik. Initial coordinates and tracking data were relayed. The first move was made in a game no one had expected to play. Out there, in the cold, dark water, was not just a showpiece. It was a predator that had mastered the art of silence on a scale no one had ever thought possible. That fractured whisper on the sonar was more than the sound of a submarine. It was the sound of an entire doctrine of naval warfare beginning to crack. In the frigid depths of the Norwegian Sea, a silent war was being waged. A war of whispers and echoes, fought not with torpedoes, but with patience and processing power. Within minutes of a new contact, patrol aircraft would be clawing their way into the sky, their mission to lay a precise net of sonobuoys across the projected path of a Soviet Typhoon. Flash messages, encrypted and urgent, rippled through the water to NATO submarines ghosting through their patrol zones. A high-value target was on the board. The apex predators of the deep, the attack submarines, would alter their course, maneuvering into the path of their quarry. Their goal was not to kill, but to listen, to gather the priceless acoustic intelligence on this mysterious, deep-diving titan. This was the choreography of containment, a dance rehearsed to perfection in countless exercises. NATO's entire strategy against the Soviet ballistic missile fleet hinged on this very sequence. It began with a faint whisper, a disturbance detected by the vast underwater listening network known as SOSUS. It ended with a relentless, coordinated pursuit. The objective was absolute: to deny the Soviet fleet the one thing it craved above all else, acoustic sanctuary. To strip away the ocean's cloak of invisibility and keep these second-strike weapons under constant surveillance. Every Soviet boomer that dared to run the gauntlet of the Greenland-Iceland-GIUK Gap was met with this suffocating attention. Tracked without pause from the moment it entered the Norwegian Sea, until it either turned for home or was swallowed by the immense, crushing silence of the Atlantic. At 4:46 in the morning, the routine was shattered. The signature vanished. It did not fade gradually, as a submarine might when slipping below a thermal layer or simply moving beyond the range of the sensors. The 24,000-ton vessel, a machine of unimaginable complexity and power, simply ceased to exist. Acoustically, it was as if a god had reached down and flipped a single, silent switch, silencing every pump, every turbine, every last hum of its life support systems in the same impossible instant. Bradley stared at the waterfall display, his mind refusing to accept the data his eyes were seeing. One moment, the Typhoon was there, a rich, complex tapestry of sound woven across a dozen frequency bands, its unique signature painting the screen with familiar, threatening patterns. The next, there was nothing. Only the ambient, chaotic noise of the ocean itself. The random acoustic static of waves and marine life that, to a trained ear, was the sound of an empty sea. His first rational thought: equipment failure. The SOSUS arrays were miracles of engineering, but they were also fantastically complex, prone to the occasional ghost in the machine. A sensor malfunction, a signal processing error. These could theoretically wipe a contact from the screen. He began the diagnostics, his fingers moving with practiced speed. But with every query, the mystery deepened. Every system reported normal operation. The hydrophones scatter the ocean and translating it into electrical signals exactly as they were designed. The signal processors, the electronic heart of the system, were operating well within their specified parameters, their algorithms sifting through the data without fault. The communications links, the vital arteries connecting the deep-sea arrays to his monitoring station, showed no interruption, no degradation in performance. The machine was telling him the truth. The machine was telling him the impossible had happened. The hunter, so certain of its methods and its mastery of the deep, was now staring into a void where a 24,000-ton weapon of war had been just a moment before. The great game of cat and mouse had rules, and those rules had just been broken. The search parameters bloomed outwards, a desperate digital net cast into the abyss. On Bradley's command, the computer systems reached beyond their primary territory, interrogating the adjacent hydrophone networks, listening for a whisper, a shadow, an echo. Perhaps the Typhoon had slipped through a seam in their coverage, a ghost navigating the blind spots between sensors. The adjacent arrays answered with nothing, a profound and unnerving emptiness. The digital ghost hunt intensified. He queried satellite communications, demanding any trace of the contact. He scanned the surface with radar, a sweeping electronic gaze that found only waves. He commanded infrared sensors to search for a heat bloom against the cold Atlantic. But the ocean kept its secrets. He reviewed visual reports from maritime patrol aircraft, their human eyes seeing only the endless gray expanse. All negative. Every door he opened led to the same empty room. He rewound time, pulling up the acoustic data from the final minutes before the vanishing. He was no longer hunting for a location, but for an explanation, a clue. Some subtle shift in the submarine's voice that might signal an unusual maneuver, a preparation for an impossible act. The signature was a flat line of predictability. Steady, unremarkable. The rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of a leviathan, right up until the moment it simply ceased to exist. The waterfall display continued its relentless, impartial cascade, a river of green and black data, charting the ocean's ambient symphony in real time. Bradley could see it all, the normal, chaotic background noise of the deep, the random pops and clicks of biological activity, the chatter of a world unseen, the low-frequency rumble of distant surface ships, their engines a faint groan carried for miles, the occasional, sharp transient of geological activity, the planet itself shifting in its sleep. But nowhere in that vast acoustic spectrum was there a single trace of a 24,000-ton war machine that had been screaming its presence just moments before. It was as if the Typhoon had performed a miracle of physics, as if every piece of machinery, every spinning turbine, every humming console had been extinguished in the same single instant. A silent, drifting mass of cold steel. Except that was a fantasy. A submarine is a creature of noise. It cannot live without the thrum of its reactors. It cannot survive without the ceaseless whine of coolant pumps, the hum of electrical generators, the breath of life support systems. A silent submarine is a dead submarine, and there had been no sound of death. Bradley called him over. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb, the shift supervisor, a man whose memory was an archive of the Cold War's deepest secrets, a veteran sonar technician with 23 years spent hunting the ghosts of the Soviet fleet. Webb had been in the Navy before the SOSUS network was a household name among submariners. He had witnessed the very evolution of this hunt. From crude, primitive hide to decipher this impossibility, it was Webb. Webb approached the console, his weathered face illuminated by the phantom green glow of the monitors. He studied the displays in a deep, unbroken silence. He replayed the moment of disappearance, watching the signature evaporate from reality with an abruptness that violated every law his experience had taught him. Submarines did not just stop. His fingers moved with practiced economy. He expanded the frequency analysis, dissecting the acoustic spectrum, band by individual band. He was searching for a trick, a clever deception. Perhaps the Typhoon had somehow shifted its entire acoustic energy, pushing its voice into frequencies outside their normal range of hearing. He found nothing. The silence was absolute, across every channel. He then searched for the sounds of catastrophe, for the telltale scream of a hull breach under pressure, for the concussive boom of a catastrophic failure. He listened for the secondary explosions, for the acoustic signatures of flooding compartments and collapsing structural frames. The ocean offered no such evidence, no violent, transient sounds, no echoes of a dying machine. There was only the before and the after, and in between, a moment of perfect, inexplicable silence, where a giant of the deep had been erased from the world. The silence was the first anomaly, not the deep, crushing quiet of the abyssal plain, but a new kind of silence, an artificial void where, moments before, a giant had been breathing. For more than 2 decades, the man named Webb had lived his life through headphones, his world defined by the spectral whispers of the deep. He had charted the secret highways of the Norwegian Sea, learning the unique dialects of propeller cavitation, the resonant hum of reactor cores. He knew the acoustic fingerprints of every major vessel in the Soviet Northern Fleet. He had tracked hundreds. He had hunted them through thermal layers that could swallow a sound whole, listened as they wee. But he had never seen this. His voice, when it finally came, was stripped of all alarm, carrying only the weight of profound, chilling certainty. A submarine of that magnitude, a behemoth of the Typhoon class, does not simply vanish. It is not a trick of the water. It is not an equipment malfunction. It is a violation of the laws of physics. A vessel displacing 48,000 tons, a mobile arsenal larger than a World War II aircraft carrier, possesses a physical presence. It displaces water. It radiates heat. It makes a sound. To erase that presence from every sensor simultaneously was an act of impossible science. Bradley, sitting beside him, felt the cold realization spread not from the mind, but from the gut. This was not an accident. This was a statement. The Soviets had not lost a submarine. They had unveiled a weapon, a technology that could render the largest, most powerful submersible ever constructed acoustically invisible. It meant that every defense, every strategy, every billion-dollar listening post dotting the ocean floor from Greenland to the United Kingdom was now obsolete. The entire foundation of NATO's maritime security had just been vaporized in an instant of inexplicable silence. Webb began the protocols, his movements precise, automatic. A lifetime of training taking over where comprehension failed. Detailed messages, encrypted and flagged with the highest urgency, began their silent journey up the intelligence chain. The incident would be sealed, buried under layers of classification so deep that few would ever know it happened. Within hours, the raw data, a mere 23 minutes of audio, arrived at specialized analysis centers across the Western world. Teams of the sharpest minds in naval intelligence would soon be gathered in sterile, windowless rooms, staring at waterfalls of green and black data, trying to decipher a magic trick. They would dissect every decibel, every frequency spike, every subtle overtone. The rest of Bradley's shift became a vigil, a desperate hope that the phantom would reappear, that the silence was a fleeting anomaly, a ghost in the machine. But the hours bled into one another, marked only by the steady, indifferent sweep of the clock. The vast patch of ocean where the Leviathan had been remained utterly, unnervingly empty, as if it had been a collective hallucination, as if it had never been there at all. The only proof that something unprecedented had occurred was now the most precious and terrifying artifact in the Cold War. 23 minutes of a sound that no longer existed. A recording that would become the most intensely scrutinized piece of audio in the history of espionage. 90 minutes after the urgent call, Dr. William Patterson stepped into the muted chaos of the monitoring station. He was a man who moved with a quiet, academic gravity. His reputation built over 3 decades of seeing the future in the faint signals of the present. He was the Office of Naval Intelligence's prophet, the analyst who possessed an almost unsettling ability to predict Soviet intentions before they became reality. It was Patterson who had foretold the coming of the Alpha-class submarines, their radical titanium hulls dismissed by his peers as impossibly expensive, technologically impractical. He was right. It was Patterson who argued the new Delta class would be far quieter than initial estimates suggested, forcing a complete overhaul of tracking doctrine. He was right. And he was among the very first to grasp that the Typhoon was not merely a larger submarine, but a fundamental shift in strategic thinking. Now he was here to listen to the sound of a ghost, to analyze the final recorded words of a machine that had, against all logic, learned how to disappear. The fate of the world's oceans now rested on what he might hear in those 23 minutes of impossible silence. In the hushed, sterile air of an Icelandic listening post, a ghost was singing. A song of immense pressure, of turbines spinning with brutal force, of water being torn apart by unseen blades. It was a sound that spoke of something fundamentally different, a new Leviathan moving through the abyssal dark. And by a stroke of pure chance, the one man on Earth best equipped to interpret this phantom hymn was already there. His name was Patterson. He had come to Iceland for a routine review of the sound surveillance system, the vast underwater network of hydrophones that formed NATO's ears in the North Atlantic. A simple inspection, part of a familiar circuit. But fate had placed him at the epicenter of a mystery the moment it was born. He was perfectly positioned to dissect the anomaly while the data was still raw, still vibrating with the energy of the unknown. The incident would not be relegated to a data packet sent across an ocean to a distant headquarters. It would be met, here and now, by one of the most seasoned minds in the silent war beneath the waves. He settled into the chair, the warmth of a coffee cup a small anchor in the cold tension of the room. Before him, the acoustic data spooled out, a river of light and shadow. At 61, Patterson had seen it all. He had tracked the clumsy, asthmatic diesel boats of the early Cold War, vessels that barely had the breath to reach the mid-Atlantic. He had witnessed their evolution into the sleek, nuclear-powered predators that now haunted the depths, challenging the very notion of Western naval supremacy. His mind was an archive of Soviet submarine design, built from technical journals, from the careful debriefing of defectors, from the ghosts captured by acoustic intelligence. He had learned to read these signatures not as a scientist reads a chart, but as a linguist deciphers a lost language. He heard the subtle dialects, the unique inflections that others missed. He could distinguish between classes, certainly. But Patterson's true art was in hearing the individual. The minute variations in manufacturing, the idiosyncratic groans of a specific gear or pump shaft. These were the acoustic fingerprints that told him not just what was out there, but who. For him, this was never just science. It was an intuition honed over decades, a deep instinctual understanding of the ocean's dark grammar. The recording began. The operator replayed the contact from its first whisper. Patterson watched the waterfall display, his face a mask of professional neutrality, his mind absorbing every nuance. And then it appeared. A presence so immense it seemed to bend the very water around it. A signature of impossible scale and power, evidence of a colossal submarine operating at a significant depth. For 23 minutes it held its course, a steady, unwavering beat, the metronomic heartbeat of a predator on the move. Consistent, predictable. Then the world fell away. With an abruptness that defied physics, it simply stopped. Not faded, not diminished, stopped. The thrum of machinery, gone. The violent hiss of propeller cavitation, gone. The sound of the ocean itself sliding across a massive hull, gone. Every decibel of acoustic energy that had painted such a vivid, terrifying portrait of the submarine's existence was extinguished in a single, silent moment. The screen showed nothing. The speakers hissed with the empty sound of the deep ocean. Where a titan had been, there was now only a void. The silence that remained was infinitely louder and infinitely more terrifying than the noise it had replaced. Patterson had spent a lifetime listening to the sounds of the enemy. But this was the sound of a new rule being written in a game he thought he knew. The sound of a ghost learning how to vanish. The playback ended. The room, filled with the low hum of machinery, was now dominated by a profound silence. For nearly a full minute, Patterson did not move. He was a statue, processing an event that defied the known laws of naval warfare. Then, a quiet command. Run it again. This time, it was a dissection. He had Bradley isolate the frequencies, peeling back the layers of the deep, resonant thrum of a nuclear reactor at work, the steady churn of its coolant pumps, the very heartbeat of the machine. He needed to analyze the high-frequency signatures, the hiss of water flowing over a massive steel hull, the distinctive crackle of propeller cavitation, the submarine's breath. And then the mid-range, the complex harmonics of reduction gears, the whine of auxiliary systems, the mechanical skeleton of the beast. The technical analysis did not bring clarity. It only deepened the abyss of the inexplicable. The data was a portrait of a living, breathing war machine. The Typhoon's reactor was operating at significant power, its thermal signature and coolant acoustics undeniable. To push 24,000 tons of displaced water at 11 knots required a colossal output of energy. These were not faint whispers of power that could be easily masked or throttled down. The sound profile was a textbook example of a Soviet nuclear submarine. The signature hum of the pressurized water reactor pumps, the electrical drone of the generators, the mechanical symphony of steam turbines turning the propeller shaft. These were not optional systems. They could not be silenced without stopping the submarine dead in the water. A nuclear vessel is not a car. Its engine cannot be simply turned off. Even with control rods fully inserted, the reactor core continues to bleed immense heat through radioactive decay. To prevent a catastrophic meltdown, coolant must circulate, constantly. To run the pumps and life support, generators must provide electrical power, constantly. And to maintain forward momentum, the propeller must turn. Yet, the Typhoon had done the impossible. It continued on its course, a ghost on the sonar screen, while systematically erasing every single vibration, every decibel of acoustic energy that its very existence demanded. It was a contradiction written in the language of physics, a moving object that made no sound. Harrison turned to the archives. He unlocked the secure databases, the digital vaults containing decades of accumulated knowledge on Soviet naval technology. He was hunting for a theory, a whisper of research that could explain the miracle he had just witnessed. He cross-referenced technical papers from Soviet scientific journals, dense with acoustic theory and fluid dynamics. For years, Soviet academics had published extensively on the physics of sound in water. Western intelligence services routinely collected, translated, and analyzed these documents. While they rarely mentioned military applications directly, a careful reading could reveal the theoretical bedrock upon which new weapon systems were built. The West had long operated under a core assumption that Soviets manufacturing better sound-dampening materials, a slow, arduous, and predictable race toward silence. That assumption, once a cornerstone of naval strategy, was now fracturing. The silence on the screen was not the result of a better muffler. It was something else entirely, something alien. The playback had ended, but for the men in that room, the true silence, the chilling silence of the unknown, was only just beginning. The deep ocean is a world of sound, a symphony of pressure and life, where silence is the ultimate camouflage, the decisive weapon. For decades, the West pursued this silence with an almost religious devotion. The path was one of relentless, incremental perfection, a war waged in fractions of a decibel. It was a philosophy etched into every blueprint, every polished gear. Machinery vibration was hunted down and dampened. Isolation mounts were engineered to sever the pathways of sound, preventing the hum of the reactor from ever touching the hull. Propeller blades were sculpted into complex, silent geometries, designed to slice through the water without provoking the telltale hiss of cavitation. This was a craftsman's approach, an obsessive quest to build a machine that was inherently quiet. The Los Angeles-class submarines were the masterworks of this doctrine. They were the state-of-the-art, apex predators moving through the abyss with a stealth that made them ghosts to enemy sonar. They were quiet because their very heart, the machinery that gave them life, had been taught to whisper. But a new shadow was moving in the depths, a presence so vast, yet so unnervingly silent, it defied the known laws of acoustic physics. And in the mind of one analyst, John Patterson, a radical idea began to form. He suspected the Soviets had not simply walked the same path and somehow done it better. He suspected they had chosen a different path entirely. The West's advantage was precision manufacturing, a domain where Soviet industry could not truly compete. So they hadn't tried. Instead of building a quieter engine, they appeared to have built a cage for the sound. They had mastered acoustic energy management. They were not just generating less noise, they were preventing the noise they made from ever escaping. This was a profound conceptual leap. Western boats were silent because they were refined. The new Soviet behemoth, the Typhoon, might be silent because it was insulated. Suddenly, a long-dismissed feature of Soviet design took on a terrifying new significance: the double hull. For generations, Western naval architects had employed single-pressure hulls, ringed by ballast tanks. Soviet boats, in contrast, were built with two complete concentric hulls. Analysts in the West had always interpreted this as a pragmatic, if somewhat crude, design choice. a brute force solution for a hostile environment. The space between the hulls offered reserve buoyancy, a critical buffer against catastrophic damage. It allowed for larger ballast tanks, improving dive performance. It added immense structural strength, essential for operations beneath the crushing pressure of the Arctic ice cap. Patterson now saw something else. Not a shield against ice, but a fortress against sound. A massive acoustic isolation system integrated into the very architecture of the submarine. Satellite intelligence estimated the gap between the Typhoon's two pressure hulls was nearly 5 meters. 5 meters. An immense, echoing void. This wasn't just structural support, it was an acoustic barrier. A dead space, a buffer zone that could be filled with sound-absorbing materials, or perhaps nothing at all, allowing vibrations to simply die in the empty space between worlds. The implications were seismic. The inner hull, a self-contained submarine in its own right, held all the sources of noise. The reactors, the turbines, the generators and pumps. A universe of mechanical clamor, sealed inside a pressure vessel that was itself suspended, acoustically isolated from the outer hull, the skin that actually met the water. This meant the Typhoon could potentially operate with conventional, even noisy, machinery, and still present a minimal acoustic signature to the outside world. The noise was still there. The beast was still roaring. But its roar never reached the ocean. The sound of the machine was trapped, forever echoing between two walls of steel, a prisoner within its own silent, moving cage. The hunt for silence had led the West down a path of refinement. The Soviets, it seemed, had simply built a new path. A silent world within a world, moving unheard through the deep. Perfection was a luxury the Soviet Union could not afford, especially the perfection of silence. Their nuclear submarines were marvels of brute force, underwater cathedrals of steel and atomic fire. But they were loud. The intricate dance of gears, the thrum of machinery, it all sang a song of imperfection, a fatal signature in the deep, quiet dark of the ocean. To match the whisper-quiet precision of Western engineering was a race they could not win. So they chose not to run it. In the quiet archives of the National Reconnaissance Office, a ghost was waiting. Grainy, monochrome photographs, captured from the cold vacuum of space over several years, were pulled from obscurity. They documented the birth of a Leviathan at the Severodvinsk shipyard. The first Typhoon, a vessel so massive it stretched the very definition of a submarine. As the images flickered across the screen, they told a story of its construction, piece by monumental piece. An analyst named Patterson leaned closer. He was looking for something else now, a new suspicion taking root in his mind. He was searching for the architecture of silence, not in what was inside the hull, but what was on it. The photographs revealed a detail that had long been a footnote in intelligence reports, an anomaly dismissed by photo interpreters. The Typhoon's outer hull was not smooth. It lacked the sleek, seamless finish of its American counterparts. In certain phases of its construction, before the final layers of paint were applied, its vast surfaces appeared to be covered in a strange, mottled skin. A mosaic of tiles or panels, laid out in a deliberate, repeating pattern. For years, analysts had theorized. Perhaps it was a crude form of ice protection for Arctic operations. Perhaps it was merely an artifact of Soviet shipbuilding, a rough finish to be smoothed over later. Patterson saw the truth. This was no construction flaw. This was a weapon. He was looking at anechoic tiles, a skin designed not to deflect, but to absorb, to swallow the searching pulse of enemy sonar, and return only an echo of the abyss. The concept was not born in the Cold War. German engineers of the Kriegsmarine had experimented with similar rubber coatings on their U-boats during the Second World War, a desperate attempt to render their wolf packs invisible. Both Soviet and Western navies had poured decades of research into the science of acoustic coatings. But to move from a laboratory theory to a fully operational system on a submarine the size of a skyscraper was an engineering challenge of staggering proportions. The ocean is an unforgiving environment. Each tile had to endure the crushing embrace of the deep, pressures that could warp solid steel. It had to withstand the thermal shock of plunging from temperate Atlantic waters into the freezing domain of the polar ice cap. It had to survive the violent hydrodynamic stress of high-speed maneuvers and the brutal, grinding impact of ice itself. And through it all, the tiles had to perform their one critical function. They had to remain acoustically dead. They had to be bonded to the hull with a grip that would never fail. Yet the very method of attachment could not betray the submarine by creating its own acoustic signature. It was a cascade of seemingly impossible requirements. A new understanding began to dawn. The Soviets had not tried to match Western precision. They had sidestepped the contest entirely. Instead of chasing the impossible dream of a perfectly silent machine, they had chosen a different path. They built their powerful, rugged, and fundamentally noisy machine, and then they wrapped it in a cloak of profound, artificial silence. It was an elegant, brutalist solution, born not of finesse, but of a deep understanding of physics and a willingness to solve a problem on their own terms. They had created a predator that didn't rely on the whisper of perfect machinery, but on a skin of engineered darkness. The conventional wisdom of the sea was simple. Size meant noise. A bigger engine, a larger crew, a greater displacement of water. All of it created a symphony of sound, a signature that could be heard for hundreds of miles. But the Soviet engineers behind the Typhoon-class submarine had not tried to defy this logic. They had inverted it. They had embraced the Leviathan, using its colossal frame not as a liability, but as a weapon of silence. This was a vessel the size of a Second World War cruiser, a behemoth that displaced more water than any submarine ever built. And it was meant to be a ghost. The enormous hull was not merely for carrying missiles. It was a cathedral of steel, engineered for an almost supernatural silence. It held a hull within a hull, a void that trapped the submarine's own internal life, its mechanical heartbeat, before it could ever escape into the ocean. Its skin was a thick layer of anechoic rubber, a dark cloak that swallowed the prying sonar pings of its hunters. Deep within its core, the most sophisticated machinery was cradled on mounting systems that absorbed every vibration, every tremor, every whisper of the power plant. The Typhoon was not quiet despite its size. It was quiet because its size allowed for an acoustic isolation no one had ever imagined possible. The implications were not just profound, they were terrifying. The entire architecture of Western naval defense, a strategy honed over decades of cold, tense peace, rested on a single, fragile assumption: that sound would always betray the enemy. An invisible web of hydrophones, the sound surveillance system known as SOSUS, stretched across the ocean floor. It was the West's tripwire, its guardian of the deep, a multi-billion-dollar investment designed to hear a Soviet submarine the moment it slipped from its moorings. It was the linchpin of NATO's power. And now it was potentially worthless. If a submarine of this magnitude could operate undetected in the North Atlantic, if it could simply vanish from the most advanced listening network on Earth, then the strategic balance had not just shifted, it had been shattered. Inside a secure monitoring station, intelligence analyst Patterson began to write. The words felt heavy, each keystroke echoing with the gravity of his discovery. He had drafted thousands of reports in his career, analyses of missile yields and satellite photos. But this was different. This was not a simple assessment of a new piece of hardware. It was a notification that the very foundation of their defensive doctrine had been invalidated. His counterpart, Bradley, remained glued to the hydrophone feeds, a silent vigil fueled by the desperate hope that the Typhoon would reappear, that its disappearance was a fluke, a temporary anomaly in the data, a ghost that would eventually give itself up. Patterson's task was immense. He had to translate the esoteric world of acoustic physics into the stark, clear language of command. He needed admirals and defense ministers to understand how a wall of sound could be built in the middle of the ocean. He had to describe the probable Soviet technologies without overstating the certainty of his limited intelligence. Above all, he had to convey the sheer strategic danger without inciting a panic that could lead to rash, catastrophic decisions. This document would travel through the most secure channels, landing on the desks of men who would have to decide how to confront a threat they could no longer see or hear. As he typed, his gaze kept drifting to the waterfall display. Hours ago, it had shown the faint, spectral signature of the Typhoon. Now, it was just a cascade of empty noise. A void. Somewhere out in the cold, dark expanse of the Norwegian Sea, a shadow larger than a city block was gliding through the depths. It was invisible to the sensors that were supposed to be their eyes. It was deaf to the network that was supposed to be their ears. It was a new law of naval warfare, moving with a silence so profound it carried the weight of a scream. It was a ghost, a technological specter that haunted the deepest corridors of Western intelligence, a machine they had sworn could not exist. For decades, they had meticulously tracked the Soviet naval program, charting its every slow, predictable step. They believed they understood the rules of the game, the limits of the possible. They were profoundly wrong. The origin of this phantom was not found in some secret advanced facility in the Urals, but hidden in plain sight. In Leningrad's Industrial Admiralty District, a cluster of nondescript concrete buildings stood against the perpetually gray sky. This was the Rubin Central Design Bureau. From the outside, these structures were deliberately unremarkable, offering no clue to the revolutionary designs taking shape in the classified workshops within. This was the heart of Soviet submarine power, the very institution that had transformed a coastal defense force into a blue-water fleet capable of challenging the dominance of the world's oceans. Inside these walls, vast design halls were cathedrals of methodical progress. A sea of drafting tables, intricate scale models, and towering stacks of technical drawings chronicled a philosophy etched in steel and caution. Soviet submarine design was a deliberate, almost glacial evolution. Each new class was a careful step forward, a refinement of the last, never a reckless leap into the unknown. The process was a reflection of both a rigid bureaucratic culture and a brutal pragmatism. Building these leviathans was an undertaking of monumental expense. A single miscalculation could send a generation of work and hundreds of lives to the crushing darkness of the abyss. Then, in 1973, a directive arrived from the Naval High Command. A challenge that shattered the long-held tradition of caution. The operational RSM-52 ballistic missiles. Each weapon was a titan of engineering, over 16 meters long and weighing approximately 90 tons. This new vessel had to be a submerged, mobile missile field of unprecedented scale. It needed to operate year-round under the crushing pressure of the Arctic ice, creating an untouchable bastion where NATO anti-submarine forces could not easily penetrate. And the final, most critical demand, the one that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It had to be silent. A ghost in an ocean wired for sound, an ocean where sophisticated NATO listening networks could track a whisper across thousands of miles of water. Faced with this trinity of impossible demands, the architects at Rubin approached the problem from a fundamentally different direction. They would not attempt to out-engineer the West at its own game. They conceded that Soviet industry lagged behind in the art of precision manufacturing. Building a quieter machine was not the answer. So they changed the question entirely. Instead of focusing on silencing the source of the noise, they would build a cage for the sound itself. They would devise a way to prevent the sound energy from ever reaching the hull, from ever bleeding out into the surrounding water. This was a profound conceptual shift, a move away from source quieting and towards total energy management. It was the difference between trying to whisper a secret in a crowded room and speaking in a normal voice from within a perfectly soundproofed chamber. The result of this new philosophy was not simply a quieter submarine. It was a new category of predator, a machine that did not just move through the ocean, but became one with its silence. The ghost that haunted the West now had a form, forged in the quiet concrete halls of Leningrad, and it would redefine the cold calculus of undersea warfare forever. To hunt in the deep, one must first become a ghost, a shadow moving through a world of sound, unheard, unseen, undetected. For the Soviet Typhoon-class submarine, this vanishing act was not a tactic, it was its very reason for being. The secret began not with a weapon, but with an idea, an architecture of profound silence. At its core was the double hull, a revolutionary design that was far more than a simple safety measure. This was not one submarine, but two, nested one inside the other. Two complete, independent pressure hulls, each capable of sustaining the vessel alone, separated by a chasm of nearly 5 meters of carefully engineered space. This vast emptiness was the first line of defense, a deliberate, calculated void designed to sever the connection between the machine and the sea. The inner hull was a prison for noise. Here, in the heart of the Leviathan, was the cacophony of life and power. The thrum of nuclear reactors, the scream of steam turbines, the relentless grind of reduction gears, the hum of generators, and the chorus of auxiliary pumps. Every sound necessary for a city to function deep beneath the waves was contained within this inner sanctum. The outer hull was a shroud. It provided the sleek hydrodynamic form that sliced through the water, but its primary purpose was acoustic. It was a barrier, a shell engineered to prevent the violent symphony within from ever bleeding into the ocean. It was the boundary between the submarine and its hunter. But this structural isolation was only the first layer of deception. The true genius lay on the surface. Soviet material scientists had spent years on a quest for the perfect cloak of invisibility, and they found it in a complex anechoic coating, a second skin that would cover every inch of the Typhoon's vast exterior. This was no simple layer of rubber. It was a composite matrix, built up from multiple layers of a specialized synthetic compound. Each layer was riddled with precisely sized cavities, microscopic voids engineered to resonate at specific frequencies. This multi-layered approach was a direct answer to the full spectrum of NATO's listening devices, from the low-frequency growl of machinery to the high-frequency shriek of active sonar. When the enemy's sonar waves struck the hull, it was not met with a hard, reflective surface. There was no sharp echo to betray the submarine's position. Instead, the acoustic energy was invited inside, trapped within this labyrinth of synthetic rubber. The sound waves caused the engineered cavities to vibrate, resonating at their tuned frequencies. This vibration generated molecular friction, a storm of motion on an invisible scale, which converted the lethal acoustic energy into simple, harmless heat. The sound was not blocked. It was consumed. It was metabolized. This skin was applied in a painstaking mosaic of overlapping tiles, creating a seamless, unbroken acoustic absorber across the entire vessel. Each tile measured approximately 1 square meter and was 3 centimeters thick, manufactured to specifications of almost impossible exactitude. They had to be identical. Any variation in a tile's absorption characteristics, any flaw in its composition, would create an acoustic weak point. A single imperfect tile could compromise the entire system, screaming the submarine's location across the ocean. The manufacturing of these tiles was a monumental industrial challenge. It demanded absolute control over the rubber vulcanization process, ensuring every single tile possessed the exact same material properties. The cavities within had to be formed with microscopic precision. This was not mass production. It was a national obsession with silence, realized 1 perfect square meter at a time. And so, the paradox was complete. A vessel of immense power, designed not to project force, but to create an absence. The double hull, the engineered chasm, the all-consuming skin, all served a single purpose: to erase a giant from the world, leaving only a ghost in the water. The deep ocean demands perfection. A single millimeter, less than the thickness of a fingernail, could betray everything. A minute deviation in the rubber skin of the machine would shift its resonant frequencies, rendering its acoustic armor useless. The silence it was built to command would shatter. This was the unforgiving reality of its construction. Every single tile affixed to its hull was a promise of invisibility, a promise that had to be tested. Before installation, each one underwent a rigorous acoustic interrogation, a time-consuming, costly ritual that slowed the Leviathan's birth. But there was no alternative. The price of haste was the price of discovery. Deep within the pressure halls, an even more profound secret was taking shape. Soviet engineers were not merely muffling the submarine, they were fundamentally disconnecting its heart from its body. Every major component, a universe of violent, rotating machinery, was being set adrift. The nuclear reactors, their steam generators thrumming with contained atomic fire. The colossal main turbines. The intricate reduction gears. The electrical generators. The auxiliary pumps. Every piece was mounted upon sophisticated rafts. These rafts did not touch the hull. They floated, suspended on a complex web of pneumatic and hydraulic isolators. These systems were the vessel's silent soul. They functioned as impossibly advanced shock absorbers, catching the raw, shuddering energy of the machinery before it could ever touch the steel hull. Before it could transform into a pressure wave, a vibration radiating out into the vast, listening dark of the ocean. When the turbines spun to life, their vibrations were not transmitted. They were absorbed. The isolator mounts would catch this mechanical rage, converting it not into sound, but into a silent, dissipated warmth, bled away through viscous damping and hydraulic fluids. The scale was staggering. The reactor compartments alone rested on rafts weighing dozens of tons, massive cradles supporting the entire nuclear plant while floating on arrays of these sophisticated isolators. Each unit was a marvel of engineering, a matrix of hydraulic fluid chambers, pneumatic gas springs, and mechanical linkages. They allowed the raft to sway and move in response to the ship's own energy, all while maintaining the perfect, critical alignment of the power plant. These systems had to perform flawlessly under the most brutal conditions imaginable. The searing heat of the reactor, the biting cold of the deep sea, the constant grinding vibration of the machinery, the violent shock loads from sudden depth changes and hard maneuvers. Yet the most revolutionary aspect of this quest for silence lay at the vessel's stern, the propulsion system. For generations, the submarine's greatest vulnerability was the sound of its own movement. Traditional propellers, slicing through the water, create a phenomenon known as cavitation. As the blade tips reach a critical speed, the local pressure drops so low that the water itself boils, forming a cloud of vapor bubbles. The collapse of these bubbles produces a distinctive, crackling hiss, an acoustic signature that sonar operators could detect across entire oceans. It was the sound of a predator giving itself away. Soviet engineers sought to eliminate this sound entirely. They developed propeller designs that were less a tool of propulsion and more a work of hydrodynamic sculpture. The Typhoon's 7-bladed propeller was a masterpiece of this new philosophy. It featured continuously varying pitch angles along the length of each blade, combined with specially shaped tips. This complex geometry was engineered to maintain local pressures just above the cavitation threshold, even at high rotational speeds. The blades were not merely cast, they were polished to microscopic tolerances, erasing any imperfection that could disrupt the water's flow, any flaw that could trigger the telltale hiss of a collapsing bubble. This was the doctrine of total acoustic stealth, a cloak of silence woven from 1,000 different threads. From the precisely measured rubber on its outer skin, to the floating heart of its machinery, to the impossibly smooth blades that pushed it through the abyss. Every component was designed with one singular purpose: to make a giant of the deep move as a ghost, its passage marked only by the silent displacement of water. In the crushing dark of the abyss, a new predator moved. Its passage was marked not by a roar, but by a profound and deliberate silence. The secret began at its stern, with a propeller operating inside a masterfully engineered shroud. This was no simple casing. It was a carefully shaped ring, an annular channel designed to tame the violent physics of water. It controlled the flow, preventing the high-velocity jets from the propeller tips from colliding with the slower, ambient sea. That collision, that chaotic mixing, is the very source of turbulence, the source of noise. The shroud suffocated it before it could be born. And for any sound that might escape, the shroud's interior was lined with anechoic material, a final layer of insulation to absorb the last whispers of the machine's rotation. 3,000 miles away, in the sterile quiet of Western intelligence, the ghost of this machine was slowly taking shape. It was a puzzle assembled from whispers, from fragmented data, from shadows on the ocean floor. The breakthrough arrived not from a spy on the ground, but from an eye in the sky. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a materials physicist at the Naval Research Laboratory, was staring at high-resolution satellite imagery of Soviet shipyards. She saw the colossal shapes of the Typhoon-class submarines under construction. But she saw something more, something wrong. The surface textures were not the smooth, painted finishes of Western naval doctrine. They were tiled, a subtle, reptilian pattern that spoke a language she was uniquely qualified to understand. Chen recognized the signature. It was a ghost from theoretical physics, a concept known as acoustic metamaterials, substances engineered not merely to exist, but to actively manipulate sound waves in ways that defied convention. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her calculations painting a terrifying picture. Properly designed, these coatings could absorb up to 90% of incident sonar energy across the most critical frequency bands. The sonar pulse would go out, but it would never come back. The implications were staggering, rippling through the highest levels of command. The Soviets had not caught up to Western precision manufacturing. They had sidestepped it entirely, forging an alternative, alien path to acoustic stealth. A frantic, clandestine effort began. Western analysts started a theoretical reconstruction of the Typhoon's probable design. They modeled every known noise reduction technique, every trick in the engineering handbook. Then they pushed further, into the realm of concepts their own designers had considered but dismissed as impractical, as too ambitious. Suddenly, the submarine's most baffling feature made perfect, chilling sense: the double hull. It wasn't just for resilience, it was a fortress of silence. An elegant, brutal solution that turned the vessel's massive size from a liability into a profound acoustic advantage. The findings of the analysis team were documented in a comprehensive, classified assessment. A technical Bible that would eventually run to over 200 pages of dense analysis, intricate diagrams, and dire strategic warnings. The conclusion was unavoidable. The Typhoon represented a fundamental schism in submarine design, a breakthrough that achieved noise levels comparable to Western submarines, a fraction of its size. The Soviets had not simply built a quieter engine, they had built a vessel that swallowed sound. Their approach was founded on absorption and isolation, not just source quieting. It was a philosophy that changed the very nature of underwater warfare, a silent revolution that forced an entire generation of Western designers back to the drawing board, to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the dark, cold silence of the deep. In the deep, cold, dark, silence is not an absence of sound. It is an achievement, a weapon forged from two opposing philosophies. The American path to invisibility was a symphony of precision, a relentless pursuit of mechanical perfection. Every piece of machinery was meticulously crafted, engineered to generate the faintest possible vibration. Propellers, balanced to the gram, spun through the water without betraying their presence, with a telltale hiss of cavitation. Shaft bearings and reduction gears aligned with microscopic accuracy, turning immense power into a whisper. This was stealth born from flawless manufacturing, from a belief that a machine could be made so perfect it would simply disappear into the ambient noise of the ocean. The Soviet approach was different. It was a philosophy of containment, born from a brutal pragmatism. It accepted a fundamental truth: their machinery would be loud, perhaps louder than its Western counterparts. So instead of chasing an impossible perfection, they chose a different path. They would not silence the machine. They would build a cage for its sound, a fortress of structural isolation and absorption, where noise was trapped, dampened, and smothered before it could ever reach the water. It was a strategy that played to their strengths in material science, a cunning workaround for their weaknesses in precision engineering. A different road to the same terrifying destination. 3 levels beneath the Pentagon, in a secure conference room scrubbed of daylight, the consequences of this philosophy were becoming terrifyingly clear. For 8 straight hours, strategic planners had stared at calculations that no longer held. The cold calculus of nuclear deterrence, the bedrock of global stability, was fracturing. It was breaking against the silence of a single machine, the Typhoon-class submarine. A vessel that could simply vanish from the most sophisticated sensors ever devised by NATO. The crown jewel of American anti-submarine warfare was a system known as SOSUS, a vast, invisible web of underwater listening posts, an acoustic tripwire stretching from the ice floes of Greenland to the shores of the United Kingdom, from Norway down to the Azores. It was an acoustic fence, designed with one purpose: to hear the Soviet fleet coming. For over 2 decades, at a cost exceeding $4 billion, it had been the sleepless guardian of the Atlantic. Thousands of personnel, in silent monitoring stations and vast analysis centers, had listened to its whispers, successfully tracking Soviet movements throughout the Cold War. Under the right conditions, intelligence suggested SOSUS could hear a submarine from over 1,000 miles away. Ample time to react. Ample time to respond. But the Typhoon had torn a hole in that fence. Analysis, stark and undeniable, suggested that if one of these behemoths could defeat SOSUS, others could too. And they were coming. Intelligence reports confirmed the Soviets were building at least 6 of them at the sprawling shipyards of Severodvinsk and Komsomolsk. More were planned. The Kremlin was committing astronomical resources to this program, a clear signal they understood the profound strategic advantage they now held. Back in the windowless room, the maps on the wall seemed to mock the men who stared at them. An entire ocean, once thought to be transparent to American ears, had suddenly gone dark. The great acoustic fence was broken. The old rules were gone. A new fear was born from the collision of 2 philosophies. And the planners realized the true weapon was not the sound a submarine made, but the deafening silence where one was supposed to be. Beneath the crushing dark of the Arctic ice, a new Leviathan stirred. A hunter built not of steel, but of silence. Each Typhoon-class submarine was a self-contained apocalypse, a sovereign territory of annihilation gliding through the deep. On board, it carried 20 solid-fuel missiles, the RSM-52. Weapons of breathtaking sophistication, each capable of traveling over 8,300 kilometers. But the true horror lay in the multiplication. Every single missile carried up to 10 independently targetable warheads. A swarm of ghosts, each seeking its own target. This meant a lone Typhoon could strike 200 separate cities, military bases, and command centers. 200 points of light extinguished. In total, a fleet of these behemoths represented 1,200 nuclear warheads, a roving arsenal that could erase every major metropolis in North America and Europe from existence. They could launch from positions the West might never even know existed. The strategic calculus, once a grim but stable equation, was shattered. The entire architecture of deterrence was built on a single, fragile assumption: time. 30 minutes. That was the accepted calculus of Armageddon. From the moment of a Soviet launch, 30 minutes for early warning satellites to scream their alert, for ground-based radar to confirm, for command authorities to process the unthinkable, and for a response to be authorized. 30 minutes. A breath. A prayer. A chance for humanity to pull back from the brink. Now, that time was severed in 2. If a typhoon could slip undetected into the Atlantic, positioning itself within 2,000 miles of the American coastline, the world would change. From such a position, its missiles would arc over the horizon, not in 30 minutes, but in 15. 15 minutes. Not enough time for protocols. Not enough time for human deliberation. The window for judgment evaporated, leaving only the cold logic of automated retaliation. The probability of a catastrophic mistake, a civilization-ending error born of panic, soared to near certainty. Commander James Worthington felt the cold of that new reality on the bridge of HMS Ark Royal. He watched the green glow of sonar screens as his anti-submarine warfare crews ran their drills in the Norwegian Sea. They were the best, the absolute pinnacle of NATO's submarine hunters. His force, built around the carrier and its Sea King helicopters, was a finely tuned instrument of detection. Dipping sonars, acoustic processors, magnetic anomaly detectors. Years of relentless training, tracking the faint whispers of older Soviet submarines. But Worthington knew. He knew they were practicing a perfect, elegant, and utterly obsolete form of warfare. The NATO tactical briefing had been a quiet, chilling affair. The data on the Typhoon was a testament to a terrifying engineering leap. Its anechoic coating, a skin of black rubber, was designed to swallow active sonar pulses, returning only silence. Its double hull design created a ghost within a ghost, its machinery shielded by an ocean of its own making. Even its propeller was a masterpiece of stealth, engineered to eliminate the telltale signature of cavitation bubbles. It moved without a whisper. Worthington looked at his helicopters, his frigates with their towed arrays, his entire tactical doctrine, all of it rendered impotent. His men were hunting for a sound that was no longer there. They were searching for a shadow in a world of absolute darkness. Soviet ingenuity had not just built a better submarine, it had created a predator that was, for all intents and purposes, invisible. A perfect weapon, waiting patiently in the deep for a command that would end the world in 15 minutes. A hunter, built of steel and silence. The ocean had lost its voice. For generations, the art of submarine warfare was a symphony of sound, a complex dance of listening, of identifying the unique acoustic signature of an enemy hull, the specific whine of its turbines. Sonar was the all-seeing eye, the all-hearing ear. Now, that ear was deaf. On the cold, rolling swells of the North Atlantic, Captain Worthington was tasked with teaching his crews how to fight a ghost. The old rules were gone, erased by a new and terrifying acoustic reality. His men were learning to hunt for whispers, for secondary indicators that might betray a presence where silence was now the primary signature. They were searching for the faintest blush of heat in the water, the thermal ghost left by a reactor's cooling system. They were sniffing the air for the barest chemical traces of a diesel generator, a scent on the wind that could mean everything or nothing. They recalibrated their instruments to detect the subtle magnetic emissions from a submarine's powerful electrical systems. Even the fundamental physics of a massive steel hull moving through the planet's magnetic field, creating a minute, almost imperceptible distortion, became a potential clue. But these were breadcrumbs in a storm. Each method was a shot in the dark, a sired proximity that was tactically suicidal. A phantom could be right beneath them, and they would never know. Yet the exercises continued, a relentless drill against an invisible enemy, because proficiency was the only armor they had left against an uncertain future. While sailors hunted for echoes on the open water, the architect of that fear was preparing to speak in Washington. Commander Sarah Mitchell stood at the precipice of a different kind of conflict, one fought not with torpedoes, but with testimony. She was the first NATO analyst to witness the impossible, the first to hear the silence. The Senate Armed Services Committee room was a coliseum of quiet power, a semicircle designed to focus the entire weight of senatorial scrutiny onto a single point, onto her. 15 senators, their faces a mixture of grave concern and hardened skepticism, watched as she was sworn in. She had rehearsed this moment for weeks, distilling a universe of complex technical data into a language that men of policy and law could understand, without sacrificing an ounce of precision. She began not with charts or intelligence reports, but with a story, her story. She walked them through the sequence of events, her voice steady, recounting the routine monitoring of Soviet naval movements. Then, the anomaly. An acoustic signature of unprecedented size. A leviathan transiting through the critical strategic chasm known as the GIUK Gap. For 23 minutes, everything was by the book. Her team tracked the contact, their procedures flawless, their equipment state-of-the-art. She described the feeling in the room, the professional tension of tracking a target of this magnitude. And then she described the disappearance. It did not fade. It did not maneuver to evade. The massive acoustic signature, the sound of a small mountain moving through the deep, had simply ceased to exist. It was an instantaneous event, a violation of the laws of physics as they understood them. Diagnostics confirmed every piece of equipment was functioning perfectly. Frantic, expanded searches revealed nothing but the cold, empty sea. The Typhoon-class submarine, the subject of Project 941, had achieved a state of acoustic invisibility that shattered every known principle of submarine detection. It was a technological leap that rendered an entire generation of Western defense strategy obsolete. The senators listened, the weight of this new reality settling in the silent room. The hunt had changed. They were no longer listening for the sound of an enemy, but for the silence where an enemy should be. In a quiet room in Washington, the Cold War was being redrawn, not with maps and treaties, but with sound waves, or rather, with their absence. A woman named Mitchell stood before the Senate committee, her voice steady, her diagrams brutally simple. She was illustrating a ghost. She walked them through the architecture of this new Soviet vessel, the Typhoon. A double hull, she explained, was not merely for strength. It was a void, a calculated space between two layers of steel that created an acoustic chasm, trapping the machine's own thunder within its walls. She spoke of a skin made of anechoic tiles, a surface engineered not to reflect, but to swallow sound whole, absorbing the probing energy of sonar until nothing bounced back. It was a predator cloaked in silence. Her explanation descended deeper into the very heart of the machine. Intricate systems isolating the roar of the reactor and the churn of the turbines from the hull itself. Propellers of a radical new design, scything through the water with a whisper, not a roar. Senator Margaret Harrison, the committee chair, leaned forward. She asked for the simple truth. How had the Soviets achieved what NATO's finest minds had deemed impossible? Mitchell offered an analogy that chilled the room. The Typhoon, she said, was not a warship. It was a recording studio. A perfectly insulated chamber designed with one purpose: to prevent any sound from escaping into the vast, listening ocean. From this technical foundation, the strategic ideas of Western naval doctrine. NATO's primary defense, the Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS, a secret network of hydrophones laid across the Atlantic floor, was their tripwire, their invisible ears. For 20 years it had tracked every Soviet submarine that dared to enter the open ocean. Against this new class of vessel, it was becoming deaf. The minutes that separated peace from annihilation, she warned, were simply vanishing. Warning times for a ballistic missile attack launched from one of these silent hunters would be compressed beyond any workable response. A crisis would unfold in a blur, forcing impossible decisions in seconds. The cold, mathematical certainty of nuclear deterrence was dissolving into a fog of fundamental unknowns. Then came the cost. Billions of dollars, she projected, would be needed. Billions just to begin the research, to develop and deploy new systems that might restore a fraction of the acoustic advantage NATO had once taken for granted. The figures were staggering. But the alternative was unthinkable: to concede the depths of the ocean to a superior Soviet force, to yield the very domain that had guaranteed the alliance's security throughout the long Cold War. As the testimony echoed through the halls of Washington, reality was providing its own grim confirmation. In darkened listening posts from Keflavik to Argentia, SOSUS operators were staring at their screens in disbelief. They saw acoustic anomalies, flickering signatures where none should be, ghosts in the machine. They were brief, ambiguous, lasting mere minutes before vanishing back into the ambient noise of the sea. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not a single prototype on a shakedown cruise. The reports suggested multiple typhoons, operating in different ocean basins, all at once. They were moving in coordinated patrol patterns, a silent ballet of predators. Their operational sophistication already exceeded the most pessimistic intelligence assessments. The Soviets were not just testing a new weapon, They were executing a comprehensive strategy, deploying their most vital strategic assets in a way NATO had no immediate means to counter. They were using the Atlantic's own acoustic complexity as a cloak, weaving through its thermal layers and canyons to mask their movements. The hunters had become the hunted. In shipyards and design bureaus across America, the race was on. Naval architects, who had once led the world, now found themselves studying Soviet acoustic principles, attempting to reverse engineer the silence. A new underwater arms race had begun, one defined not by the roar of engines, but by the profound, terrifying power of silence. In the deep, cold canyons of the North Atlantic, the game had changed. Western naval commanders, accustomed to ruling the undersea domain, were now listening to a silence that was not empty. It was a silence filled with a threat they could not hear, a phantom they could not find. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a chilling realization. Their acoustic superiority, the very foundation of their strategy, had been neutralized. A frantic search for a new advantage began. Eyes in orbit, powerful infrared satellites scoured the ocean surface for the faint thermal signatures of a submerged reactor. Magnetic anomaly detectors were dragged through the depths, hunting for the subtle disturbance a massive steel hull would create in the Earth's magnetic field. Vast, towed arrays of hydrophones, miles long, were deployed with processing power beyond anything seen before. But these technologies were years, perhaps decades, from being a reliable solution. They were desperate gambles against a present and invisible danger. That danger had a name: Project 941. To NATO, it was known as the Typhoon. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, these leviathans represented the absolute pinnacle of Soviet submarine design. 6 of these giants were completed between 1981 and 1989. The TK-208, the TK-202, the TK-12, 13, 17, and the TK-20. They were the largest submarines ever built, displacing more water than a First World War battleship. Their domain was the unforgiving wilderness beneath the Arctic ice, their hunting grounds the strategic trenches of the Atlantic. Each one carried the single largest ballistic missile payload ever deployed on a submersible platform, a world-ending arsenal capable of operating with near-total impunity. The acoustic problem the Typhoons presented was never truly solved by Western navies. While sensors improved and detection algorithms grew more sophisticated, the fundamental breakthrough the Soviets had achieved remained brutally effective. The Typhoons could slip into vast acoustic sanctuaries, pockets of ocean where the background noise and complex water layers rendered conventional anti-submarine warfare almost useless. They could vanish at will, becoming one with the ocean's immense and crushing silence. What fleets of destroyers and legions of analysts could not achieve, economic gravity did. The immense cost of maintaining these colossal machines, with their complex liquid-fueled missiles and enormous crews, proved unsustainable for a post-Soviet Russia. The giant's true vulnerability was not in its hull, but in the treasury that supported it. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the boats were progressively decommissioned, their silent reign ending not with a bang, but with the slow, grinding process of disarmament. Only one remained. The last Typhoon, the original TK-208, was later renamed Dmitry Donskoy. It was converted, given a new life, as a test platform for the next generation of solid-fuel ballistic missiles, a living relic serving a new navy. Yet the ghost of the Typhoon never left the water. The acoustic principles it pioneered became doctrine. Anechoic coatings that are trapping the noise within. Advanced propeller geometry that sliced through the water with minimal cavitation. This DNA was passed down. Modern Russian submarines, the Borei-class ballistic missile carriers, and the formidable Yasen-class attack submarines are direct descendants, benefiting from the hard-won lessons of Project 941. Even Western navies, once confounded by the Typhoon, studied and adapted its philosophy. They recognized that true innovation can emerge from the most unexpected of rivals. The Typhoon stands as a monument to Soviet engineering, a stark reminder that technological superiority is a fleeting advantage. In the depths of the Cold War, a group of designers faced a problem Western experts had declared unsolvable. They created a submarine that could disappear, despite its unprecedented size. They did this not by trying to match Western manufacturing precision, but by inventing an entirely different philosophy of stealth. It was a philosophy based on total energy management, not just on quieting the source. They didn't just build a quieter machine. They built a machine that rewrote the very laws of underwater acoustics. From the West, the analysis was swift and laced with a confident dismissal. The double hull of the new Soviet behemoth was judged a clumsy, inefficient design, a brute force solution from an engineering culture a generation behind. What they failed to see was not a flaw, but a fortress, a cathedral of silence. It was a nested doll of steel, a sophisticated acoustic isolation system designed to trap the thrum of its own machinery, to swallow the submarine's own pulse before it could ever betray its position to a listening world. Then there was the vessel's skin. To Western eyes, it appeared to be a simple, thick coating of protective rubber, a crude attempt at stealth. The reality was a nightmare of physics. These were not mere tiles. They were precisely engineered metamaterials, a labyrinth built at the molecular level. Their sole purpose, to absorb the probing energy of an enemy sonar, to drink in its acoustic light and return only whispers. 90% of a hunter's searching ping would vanish into that black skin, never to return. And the propellers. They seemed conventional, almost archaic in their design. Yet this apparent simplicity masked a revolution in hydrodynamics. They were blades sculpted to slice through the water with an impossible grace, eliminating the telltale hiss of cavitation, that deadly trail of bubbles that screams a submarine's location, at speeds once thought tactically impossible. The silent hunter could now run and remain a ghost. A cold dread crept into the war rooms of the West. The foundations of NATO's anti-submarine doctrine, built on the certainty of acoustic superiority, began to crack. The response was a frantic, desperate surge of innovation, a technological arms race that would define naval warfare for decades to come. The hunt went beyond sound. The realization that listening was no longer enough sparked a multi-billion-dollar investment in entirely new ways of seeing in the dark. Fleets of sensors were deployed to detect the subtle scars a submarine leaves on the ocean itself, the faint magnetic anomalies, the thermal blooms from its reactor, the electromagnetic whispers from its hull. The search even reached for the heavens, with satellite systems designed to spot the ghostly, lingering wakes these giants left on the ocean's surface, patterns visible only from the cold vacuum of space. Signal processing became a new frontier. Analysts transformed into digital archaeologists, designing complex algorithms to sift through the cacophony of the ocean, to find that one faint alien signature buried in a universe of noise. Torpedo technology was forced to evolve at a blistering pace. A new generation of hunter-killers was born, weapons engineered to chase down phantoms moving at speeds that were, until now, the stuff of fiction. The strategic impact was even more profound than the technological one. The Typhoon forced NATO to abandon a dangerous illusion that the underwater domain was a territory it controlled. The deep ocean was no longer a western lake. It was a contested battle space, where Soviet leviathans could operate with near impunity in waters once considered home. This single, terrifying recognition reshaped everything, from the composition of naval fleets to the chilling calculus of nuclear war planning. A new, more cautious realism settled over the strategic balance of power. The Cold War thawed before the full, terrifying potential of the Typhoon class could be unleashed in open conflict. Their missiles were never fired in anger. They never had to prove in combat what they had already proven on 1,000 silent, peacetime patrols. Their mere existence was enough. Their presence in the deep altered the arithmetic of global power, forcing a response that continued to shape naval engineering long after the great submarines themselves were retired to rust in northern harbors. Project 941 created holes in the water, absences where colossal force once resided. But in doing so, they transformed submarine warfare forever. They were a testament that radical innovation could shatter conventional advantages, that different philosophies of engineering could arrive at the same deadly result through entirely different paths. They proved that the ocean's acoustic soul remained a mystery, even to those who believed they had mastered its every secret. The Typhoon's legacy endures. It lives in every modern submarine cloaked in anechoic coatings. It resonates in every acoustic isolation mount that severs a machine's vibration from the hull. It spins in every propeller blade meticulously designed to move without a whisper. The principles once dismissed as inefficient, pioneered by Soviet engineers in secret cities, now influence the design of silent hunters across the globe, a lasting echo of the giants that once ruled the abyss. From the crushing blackness of the abyss, a new Leviathan emerged. It was far more than a triumph of engineering, more than a vessel of titanium and steel. The Typhoon was a statement, written in silence and shadow. It was the physical embodiment of a defiant idea, that the established order, so certain of its dominance, could be challenged from the depths. A single, silent hunter that sent a tremor of doubt through the world's most powerful navies. Every long-held assumption about underwater supremacy was suddenly rendered fragile, obsolete. The ocean has always been the keeper of secrets, a final frontier on our own world. The Typhoon was not merely a machine built to conquer that frontier. It became one of its greatest mysteries, a testament to the unnerving truth that the silent depths will always hold surprises for those who believe they have mastered them.